Hello, YouTube. We're continuing with Nietzsche and Philosophy by Deleuze. 10. Nietzsche and Kant from the point of view of consequences. The Nietzschean and Kantian conceptions of critique are opposed on five main points. 1. Genetic and plastic principles that give an account of the sense and value of beliefs, interpretations and evaluations rather than transcendental principles, which are simple conditions for so-called facts. Okay, so genetic and plastic principles that give an account of the sense and value of beliefs, interpretations and evaluations. That's Nietzsche rather than Kant's transcendental principles. Okay, so we'll say Nietzsche's principles are plastic and about the genesis of sense and value in regards to beliefs, interpretations, and evaluations, whereas Kant's principles are transcendental and describe the conditions of possibility for facts. They're going to dictate. Since we're doing something. 2, a thought which thinks against reason rather than a thought that believes itself to be legislative because it is subject to reason alone. Quote, that which will always be impossible, a reasonable being, Zarathustra. It is a serious mistake to think that irrationalism opposes anything but thought to reason, whether it be the rights of the given, of the heart, of feeling, caprice, or passion. In irrationalism, we are concerned only with thought, only with thinking. What is opposed to reason is thought itself. What is opposed to the reasonable being is the thinker himself. 22. Untimely meditations. David Strauss. 1. Schopenhauer educator. 1. The opposition of private and public thinker. The public thinker is a cultivated Philistine representing reason. An analogous theme is found in Kierkegaard, Feuerbach, and Chestov. What has this got? Nietzsche's principles. This is principles are plastic and about the genesis of sense and value in regards to beliefs, interpretations, and evaluations, whereas Kant's principles are transcendental and describe the conditions of possibility for facts. Good dictation. That could be just regarding, yeah. Regarding beliefs. Plastic. R is a form to be. Plastic, that is malleable. malleable, contingent, and about the genesis of sensibilities regarding beliefs, interpretations, and whereas Kant's principles are transcendental and universal, and describe the condition of possibility of facts. To this bit. A thought which thinks against reason rather than a thought that believes itself to be legislative because it is subject to reason alone. Okay, so a thought which thinks against reason is Nietzsche, and I don't know. That which will always be impossible, a reasonable being. It is a serious mistake to think that irrationalism opposes anything but thought to reason, whether it be the rights of the given, of the heart, of feeling, caprice, or passion. In irrationalism, we are concerned only with thought, only with thinking. What is opposed to reason is thought itself. What is opposed to the reasonable being is the thinker himself. Because it is reason which receives and expresses the rights of that which dominates thought, thought reconquers its rights and becomes a legislator against reason. The dice throw. This was the sense of the dice throw. I don't understand that at all. So I understand, but I don't know what they mean by thinking against reason. So I just going to ask the bot to think for me because it does a good job of thinking for me. And I might forget how to think, which is bad, but no, this one. Doesn't seem to know. Pies. Explain this from Deleuze, nature, and philosophy. This is a dense and very characteristic Deleuze passage, and it helps to slow it down and keep three distinctions absolutely clear: reason versus thought, the reasonable being versus the thinker, and irrationalism versus unreason. I'll unpack it step by step, then pull it together with an image of the dice throw. What Deleuze is opposing, Kantian legislative reason. Deleuze is targeting a Kantian picture of critique. For Kant, reason legislates. It gives laws to thought. A reasonable being is one who submits thinking to universal necessary rules. Critique determines the conditions under which thought is legitimate. In that framework, thought is valid because it conforms to reason. Reason is the tribunal. Thought obeys. Deleuze says Nietzsche explodes this model. 2, a thought which thinks against reason. This does not mean being anti-intellectual, valuing feeling over thinking, romantic irrationalism, letting passion replace concepts. Deleuze is very explicit. It is a serious mistake to think that irrationalism opposes anything but thought to reason. So Nietzschean irrationalism is not the rights of the given, empiricism, the heart, sentiment, feeling, caprice, or passion. These are not thinking. Nietzsche is not replacing reason with emotion. Instead, Nietzsche pits thought itself against reason. Reason versus thought, this is the key distinction. For Deleuze, reason equals a system that organizes, normalizes, recognizes, justifies what already dominates thought, expresses values as if they were universal and necessary. Reason is reactive. It comes after forces have already imposed themselves. Thought, by contrast, is something that happens when thinking is forced. How come you're in here? Thought, by contrast, is something that happens when thinking is forced. It is created through encounters, violence, shocks, affects, is not governed by recognition or common sense, does not begin from rules. So when Deleuze writes, what is opposed to reason is thought itself, he means reason is a secondary stabilizing power. Thought is a primary, dangerous, creative force. The reasonable being versus the thinker. This is devastating, a devastating reversal. The reasonable being obeys reason, accepts established values, thinks correctly, is morally and epistemologically domesticated. Nietzsche says that which will always be impossible, a reasonable being. Why? Because life itself is not reasonable. Becoming, difference, force, chance, and creation cannot be legislated in advance. The thinker, by contrast, risks unreason, thinks against reason, exposes thought to what overpowers it, creates values instead of justifying existing one. So what is opposed to the reasonable being is the thinker himself. The thinker is dangerous to reason. Why reason serves domination? This sentence is crucial because it is reason which receives and expresses the rights of which thought because it is reason which receives and expresses the rights of that which dominates thought. Reason does not rule neutrally. It ratifies domination. It gives concepts to prevailing forces. It moralizes them. It universalizes them. It makes them appear necessary. In Nietzschean terms, reason speaks for reactive forces. It translates power into truth. It masks contingency and as necessity. 6, thought reconquers its rights. So what does thought do? Thought reconquers its rights and becomes a legislator against reason. This sounds paradoxical, but it's deliberate. Thought legislates, but not by universal rules, moral law, transcendental conditions. Instead, thought legislates by creation. This is Nietzsche's redefinition of critique, not judging claims by reason, but creating new values, forcing new modes of thinking to exist. The dice throw, finally, the dice throw. This was the sense of the dice throw. The dice throw is Nietzsche's image taken up obsessively by Deleuze for affirmation of chance, creation without guarantees, thinking without reason as safety net, legislation without prior law. The dice throw does not abolish necessity. It selects necessity from chance. Thought says, let whatever happens, happen. and let me affirm it. This is why the dice throw is not irrational chaos, but a higher logic of affirmation, a law born after the throw, not before it. In one sentence, Deleuze is saying Nietzsche does not oppose reason with feeling or passion. He opposes reason with thought itself, creative, risky, affirmative thought that legislates new values against the reactive laws of reason, affirming chance through the dice throw. If you want, next we can tie this directly to eternal return, compare it to Kant's architectonic, or map it onto Foucault's notion of critique, which you asked about earlier and which sits very close to this idea of thinking against reason rather than within it. No, that's all right. Okay, so a thought which thinks against reason rather than a thought that believes itself to be legislative because it is subject to reason alone. Okay. Kant's reason is a legislator given it posits universal laws, whereas Nietzsche's thought thinker thinks against this determinism, so that the thinker can create new values underpinned let me read it again. A thought which thinks against reason rather than a thought that believes itself to be legislative because it is subject to reason alone. Quote, that which will always be impossible, a reasonable being. It is a serious mistake to think that irrationalism opposes anything but thought to reason, whether it be the rights of the given, of the heart, of feeling, caprice, or passion. In irrationalism, we are concerned only with thought, only with thinking. What is opposed to reason is thought itself. What is opposed to the reasonable being is the thinker himself. Because it is reason which receives and expresses the rights of that which dominates thought, thought reconquers its rights and becomes a legislator against reason, the dice throw. This was the sense of the dice throw. By the dice throw, which is random, creativity, creativity, which is underpinned by the affirmation of the dice throw. The dice throw, which is random creativity, not law-like domination, not over authoritarian, laws, laws, laws of reason. What? 3. The genealogist rather than the Kantian legislator. Kant's legislator is an arbitrator, a justice of the peace who supervises the distribution of domains and the allocation of established values. The genealogist's genealogical inspiration is the opposite of judicial inspiration. The genealogist is the true legislator. The genealogist is something of a fortune teller, the philosopher of the future. He does not foretell a critical peace, but wars such as we have never known. Ecce Homo IV 1. He also sees thinking as judging, but judging is evaluating and interpreting. It is creating values. The problem of judgment becomes that of justice and hierarchy. Okay. Judgment. Kant's laws adjudicate adjudicate so burnish will do one into a way of being Nietzsche's genealogist I'm not understanding the bit genealogist is the true legislator. The genealogist is something of a fortune teller, the philosopher of the future. Okay, it's a critique. A genealogist asks, Nietzsche's genealogist asks how these laws as values come to be valued such. This investigation, this critique, QUE, judges and about judges judges whether the values arise via active or reactive means that's mm, 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 mm. Tell me. Uh, mm, mm. Whip. Measure for quality and quantity. Measure. We have said that active forces are the superior, dominant, strongest forces, but inferior forces can prevail without ceasing to be, ceasing to be inferior in quantity and reactive in quality. Without ceasing to be slaves in this sense, because they don't change if they're prevailing, they're still reacting. To interpret is to determine the force which gives sense to a thing. To evaluate is to determine the will to power which gives value to a thing. Sense is either active or reactive because it's a quality. Difference in quantity is therefore, in one sense, the irreducible element of quantity. In another sense, the element which is irreducible. Uh, like that. Oh. The genealogical element of force, the will to power. The will to power provides the genes to force. Like a parent, it directs force. Same family, different individual. Genetic is like, it's in the genes. Like DNA, the will to power provides the script with an affirmation or denial. an on-off value, the chance or Dionysus created, and this relation of forces, the will to that power of those forces. The difference in quantity and the respective qualities of forces in relation both derive from the will to power as genealogical element. Forces are either dominant or dominated, depending on their quantity. This hierarchy is read as a quality, as either active force or reactive force. All forces have a will to power. This is a problem of interpretation. To estimate the quality of force, that gives meaning to a given phenomena or event, and from that estimated quality, active or reactive, to measure the relation of the forces as which are present. So to interpret an event is an equation that begins with an estimation of quality. Quality as active or reactive, which is used as a basis to measure the hierarchy as either dominant or dominated forces. They are measuring the relation dominant or dominated of the forces of the event as a way to understand or interpret the event, to find out the quality as either active or reactive forces, but they begin by estimating this quality. If reactive, then dominated forces or more in quantity. So I utilizing the will to power more so than active forces. Given reactive, then they are dominated. The principle of the qualities of force is the will to power. So the will to power is the head honcho of force, deciding if it's active or reactive, which makes it necessary that the will to power's quality is permission as affirmation or denial. This is the fluency, because governing force is an agile relation. To handle force like a handler, the relationship is very close as genetic familiarity, the relationship of articulation. This connection is a will which can empower, activate, or deny nihilism. This pessimism is how the will of power governs permission. It affirms the active and denies the reactive force. It affirms, denies the active, and that's is a becoming of force. To affirm, they open the floodgates, forces in it, an affirmative or no. I guess a yes or no, or inequality becoming. Every will implies an evaluation, because to affirm or deny suggests value. To affirm is to highly value, and to deny is negative value, that which is the affirmation or denial is responding to. Back down here, critique and whereabouts this point. Kant's laws adjudicate, so burnish one into a way of being. Nietzsche's genealogist asks how the laws as values come to be valued such. This critique judges whether the values arise by active or reactive. Going up a lot. Means so either affirmed or denied as the evaluation and interpretation judges, which is is evaluating and interpreting judges. So critique evaluates, judges whether the values arise via active, interpretates, judges whether the value arises by active or reactive means. So either affirmed or denied. Anyway, judges is judging whether the values arise via active and reactive. and evaluation. Arise. The values, asking, are they active or reactive? And if so, they are either affirmed or denied. The problem of judgment becomes that of justice and hierarchy. With I'll move on for the moment. Can't think so like that. I'm going to read that over here. The reactive man serving himself rather than the reasonable being, functionary of current values, both priest and believer, legislator and subject, conquering and conquered slave. But in that case, which one undertakes critique? What is the critical standpoint? It's the philosopher of the future, right? The critical instance is not the realized man, nor any sublimated form of man, spirit, reason, or self-consciousness. It is neither God nor man, for there is still not enough difference between man and God. They can replace each other too easily. The critical instance is the will to power. The critical perspective is that of the will to power. But in what form? Not that of the overman, who is the positive product of critique itself, but there is a relatively superhuman type, Ecce Homo IV 5, the critical type, man, insofar as he wants to be gone, beyond, overcome. But you could transform yourself into forefathers and ancestors of the overman and let this be your first creation. Zarathustra, I on the Blissful Isles, page 110. The will to power opens the floodgates in an affirmation or a denial. I'll just copy that. Um, uh, the critical instance is the will to power. The critical perspective is that of the will to power. As permission, no, affirmation or denial. not that of the overman, who is the positive product of critique, but there is a relatively superhuman type, the critical type, man insofar as he wants to go beyond, man insofar as he wants to go beyond, overcome. But you could transform yourselves into forefathers and ancestors of the overman at the first creation. As affirmation or denial. Affirmation is the only way for the eternal return to produce new, which is critique, IQUE, as beyond current man. So that says here, the critical type, man insofar as he wants to go beyond, overcome. So it's about desire, wants to is a desire to go beyond current man. Five, the aim of critique is not the ends of man or of reason, but in the end, the overman, to overcome overtaken man. Okay. The point of critique is not justification, but a different way of feeling, another sensibility. Um, mm, critique is a desire to go beyond current, what do you say? Overtaken, overcome, overtaken, current man, overcome, come with reason as laws posited as universal and immutable. That's what a law is. A law. Critique is a desire to go beyond current man, who is overcome with reason as laws posited as universal and immutable. Critique desires another way. Eleven, concept of truth. Truth was posited as being, as God, as the highest court of appeal. The will to truth requires a critique. Let us thus define our own task. The value of truth must for once be experimentally called into question. Genealogy of Morals, III, 24, page 152 and 3. It is at this point that Kant is the last of the classical philosophers. He never questions the value of truth or the reasons for our subjugation to it. In this respect, he is a dogmatist as anyone else. He is as dogmatic as anyone else. None of them ask, who is seeking truth? In other words, what does the one who seeks the truth want? What is his type? His will to power. Let us try and understand the nature of this deficiency in philosophy. It is well known that, in fact, man rarely seeks after truth. Our interests and also our stupidity separate us from truth even more than our errors do. But philosophers claim that thought seeks truth, that it loves and wills truth by right. But by establishing a bond of right between truth and thought and truth, by relating the will of a pure thinker to truth in this way, philosophy avoids relating truth to a concrete will of its own, to a type of forces, to a quality of the will to power. Nietzsche accepts the problem on its own terms. He does not call the will to truth into doubt. He does not remind us once again that men, in fact, do not love truth. He asks what truth means as a concept, what forces and what will, qualified in this way, this concept presupposes by right. Nietzsche does not criticize false claims to truth, but truth in itself and as an ideal. According to Nietzsche's method, the concept of truth must be dramatized. The will to truth, which is still going to tempt us to many a hazardous enterprise, that celebrated veracity of which all philosophers have hitherto spoken with reverence. What questions this will to truth has already set before us? What really is it in us that wants the truth? We did indeed pause for a long time before the question of the origin of this will, until finally we came to a complete halt before an even more fundamental question. We asked after the value of this will. Granted, we want truth. Why not rather untruth? Why and uncertainty, even ignorance? And would you believe it? It has finally almost come to seem to us that this problem has never before been posed, that we have been the first to see it to fix our eye on it, to hazard it. Beyond Good and Evil, I, page 15. The concept of truth describes a truthful world. Even in science, the truth of phenomena forms a world distinct from that of phenomena themselves. But a truthful world presupposes a truthful man at its centre. 23. VPI 107. In order to be able to imagine a world of truth and being, it was first necessary to create the veracious man, including the fact that he believes himself veracious. How do you say that? That's truth, right? Truthful. Speaking or representing the truth. Veracious. The veracious. Something like that. Veracious. Something like that. But a truthful world presupposes a truthful man at its centre. Who is this truthful man? What does he want? First hypothesis, he wants not to be deceived, not to let himself be deceived, because it is harmful, dangerous, and inauspicious to be deceived. But this hypothesis presupposes the truthfulness of the world itself. For in a radically false world, it is the will to not let oneself be deceived that becomes inauspicious, dangerous, and harmful. In fact, the will to truth had to be formed in spite of the danger and the uselessness of the truth at any price. There remains another hypothesis. I want the truth means I do not want to deceive, and I do not want to be deceived comprises, as a special case, I do not want to deceive myself. Gay Science 344. If someone wills the truth, it is not in the name of what the world is, but in the name of what the world is not. It is understood that life aims to mislead, to dupe, to dissimulate, to dazzle, to blind. But he who wills the truth always wants to depreciate this high power of the false. He makes life an error and this world an appearance. He therefore opposes knowledge to life, and to the world he opposes another world, a world beyond the truthful world. The truthful world is inseparable from this will, the will to treat this world as appearance. Thus, the opposition of knowledge and life, the distinction between worlds, reveals its true character. It is a distinction of moral origin, an opposition of moral origin. The man who does not want to deceive wants a better world and a better life. All his reasons for not deceiving are moral ones, and we always come up against the virtuism of the one who wills the truth. One of these favourite occupations is the distribution of wrongs. He renders responsible, he denies innocence, he accuses and judges life, he denounces appearance. It has generally become clear to me that the moral or immoral intentions of every philosophy have every time constituted the real germ of life out of which the entire plant has grown. I accordingly do not believe a drive to knowledge to be the father of philosophy. Beyond Good and Evil 6, page 19. However, this moral opposition is itself only a symptom. The one who wants another world, another life, wants something more profound, life against life. Genealogy of Morals, group III, page 13, page 120. He wants life to become virtuous, to correct itself, and to correct appearance, for it to serve as the way to another world. He wants life to repudiate itself and to turn against itself, an attempt to use force to taint force. Genealogy of Morals, III 11. Thus, behind the moral opposition, there stands another kind of contradiction, the religious or ascetic contradiction. From the speculative position to the moral opposition, from the moral opposition to the ascetic contradiction, but the ascetic contradiction is, in turn, a symptom which must be interpreted. What does the man of the ascetic ideal want? The one who repudiates life is also the one who wants to diminish life, the conservation of his type, and moreover, its power and triumph, the triumph and contagion of reactive forces. At this point, reactive forces discover the disturbing ally that leads them to victory, nihilism, the will to nothingness. Genealogy of Morals, III 13. The will to nothingness, which can only bear life in its reactive form. The will to nothingness is the one that used reactive forces as a way of ensuring that life must contradict, deny, and annihilate itself. The will to nothingness from the beginning inspires all the values that are called superior to life. This is Schopenhauer's greatest error. He believed that the will is denied in all values superior to life. He believed that the will is denied in all values superior to life. In fact, it is not the will which is denied in superior values. It is the superior values that are related to a will to deny, to annihilate life. This will to deny defines the value of superior values. Its weapon is to hand life over to the domination of reactive forces in such a way that the whole of life slips further and further away, separated from what it can do, getting smaller and smaller towards nothingness, towards the poignant feeling of his nothingness. Is that how you say that? Poignant. Evoking a keenly felt sense of emotion, especially a bittersweet sadness, regret, sharp, pungent taste or smell. Late Middle English from Old French, literally pricking, present participle of poindre, from Latin pungere, to prick. The will to nothingness and reactive forces, these are the two constituent elements of the ascetic ideal. This interpretation makes its discoveries by excavating three layers: knowledge, morality, and religion, the true, the good, and the divine as values superior to life. All three are connected. The ascetic ideal is the third moment, but also the sense and value of the other two moments. We can therefore quite easily divide the spheres of influence. We can even oppose each moment to the others. We always come across the ascetic ideal, occupying all the spheres in a more or less condensed state. It is a refinement which endangers no one. Do we really believe that knowledge, science, and even the science of the free thinker, truth at any price, endanger the ascetic ideal? Everywhere else that the spirit is strong, mighty, and at work without counterfeit today, it does without ideals of any kind, except for its will to truth. But this remnant of an ideal is, if you will believe me, this ideal itself in its strictest, most spiritual formulation, esoteric through and through, with all external additions abolished. I'll read that quote again. Everywhere else, that the spirit is strong, mighty, and work without counterfeit today, it does without ideals of any kind, except for its will to truth. But this remnant of an ideal is, if you will believe me, this ideal itself in its strictest, most spiritual formulation, esoteric through and through, with all its external additions abolished. Okay, what's this one again? The concept of truth. Is based on an ideal other world, therefore one of resentiment and a denial to life, not an affirmation which is needed for the overman. Are you frozen? You're not going to let me scroll? Because you're dictating and it's taking a while. So in that case, sorry, I have to put a proper voice on. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Is based on an ideal other world. Why have you capitalised O? And why have you made that one word? The world. Therefore, wordy one needed is based. Therefore, one of three sentiment. Resentiment. Sentiment. I can do it this way. And the denial of life. Yes. You're going to let me. Yeah. Of life, not an affirmation, which is needed for the overman. Knowledge, morality, and religion. Nevertheless, there is perhaps one reason why we might like to distinguish and even oppose knowledge, morality, and religion. We ascend from truth to the ascetic ideal in order to discover the source of the concept of truth. Let us for a moment turn our attention to evolution instead of genealogy. Let us descend again to from the ascetic or religious ideal to the will to truth. We must then acknowledge that morality has replaced religion as a dogma and that science is increasingly replacing morality. Christianity as dogma has been ruined by its own morality, genealogy, morals, or morality, III, 27. What has triumphed of the Christian God is Christian morality itself, or the instinct for truth in the end forbids itself the lie of faith in God. Gay Science, 356. Or the instinct for truth in the end forbids itself the lie of faith in God. There are things today that a believer or even a priest can no longer say or think. They are reserved for a few bishops or popes. Providence and divine goodness, divine reason, divine finality. These are ways of thinking that now belong to the past, that have the voice of our conscience against them. They are immoral. Religion often needs free thinkers to survive and adapt. Morality is the continuation of religion, but by other means. Knowledge is the continuation of morality and religion, but by other means. The ascetic ideal is everywhere, but its means change. They are no longer the same reactive forces. This is why critique is so easily confused with a settling of accounts between different reactive forces. Christianity as dogma was ruined by its own morality, but Nietzsche adds, therefore Christianity as morality must also be on the road to ruin. Does he mean that the will to truth must be the ruin of morality in the same way that morality is the ruin of religion? The gain would be slight. The will to truth is still part of the ascetic ideal. The mode of approach is always Christian. Nietzsche requires something else, a change of ideal, another ideal, a different way of feeling. But how is this change possible in the modern world? As soon as we ask what the ascetic and religious ideal is, as soon as we put this question to the ideal itself, morality or virtue come forward to answer in its stead. Virtue says, what you are attacking is myself. I answer for the ascetic ideal. In religion, there is bad, but there is also good. I have collected this good together. It is I who wills this good. And when we ask, but what is this virtue? What does it want? The same story begins again. Truth itself comes forward saying, it is I who wills virtue. I answer for virtue. It is my mother and my goal. I am nothing if I do not lead this virtue. And who will deny that I am something? We are made to go back through the genealogical stages that we have covered, from truth to morality, from morality to religion, at a brisk and determined pace, under the pretext of evolution. Virtue answers for religion, truth for virtue. It is then enough to extend this movement. We cannot be made to go through these steps again without rediscovering our point of departure, which is also our springboard. Truth itself is not beyond criticism or a possession of a divine right. Critique must be a critique of truth itself. After Christian truthfulness has drawn one inference after another, it must end by drawing its most striking inference, its inference against itself. This will happen, however, when it poses the question, what is the meaning of all will to truth? And here again, I touch on my problem, on our problem, my unknown friends, for I as yet know of no friend. What meaning would our whole being possess if it were not this, that in us the will to truth becomes conscious of itself as a problem? As the will to truth thus gains self-consciousness, there can be no doubt that morality will gradually perish now. This is the great spectacle in 100 acts reserved for the next 2 centuries in Europe, the most terrible, most questionable, and perhaps also the most hopeful of all spectacles. GMIII 27, page 161. In this extremely rigorous text, every term is carefully considered. One inference after another means descending steps from the ascetic ideal to its moral form, from moral consciousness to its speculative form. But the most striking inference, its inference against itself, means this: the ascetic ideal no longer has any hiding place beyond the will to truth, no longer has anyone to answer for it. It is enough for us to continue the deduction to descend even further than they want. Then the ascetic ideal is flushed out, unmasked. It no longer has any characters at its disposal to take on its role, no more moral or scholarly characters. We have returned to our problem, but we are also at the moment which will govern the reascent, the moment of feeling differently, of changing ideals. Thus, Nietzsche is not arguing that the ideal of truth must replace the ascetic or even the moral ideal. He says, on the contrary, that calling the will to truth into question, its interpretation and evaluation, must prevent the aesthetic ideal from replacing itself by other ideals that continue it in other forms. When we denounce the permanence of the ascetic ideal in the will to truth, we deprive this ideal of the condition of its permanence or its final disguise. In this sense, we too are truthful or seekers after knowledge. 24. We, the seekers after knowledge. Likewise, Nietzsche will say that the masters are voracious men in a different sense. Genealogy of Morals, I-15. But we do not replace the ascetic ideal. We let nothing of the place itself remain. We must destroy. We want to destroy the place. We want another ideal in another place, another way of knowing, another concept of truth. That is to say, a truth which is not presupposed in a will to truth, but which presupposes a completely different will. Knowledge, morality, and religion. Knowledge. Knowledge as critique or the will to truth must descend or ascend from morality and religion, which have been replaced by the ascetic ideal. Full stop. If we want to replace the ascetic ideal, our will to truth, knowledge, must come from a different place. so that the ascetic ideal can't replace itself. You give me that, let me scroll. It's nearly the case that I'm finished critique by the looks of it. Here we go. Different will. Another way of knowing, another concept of truth, that is to say, a truth which is not presupposed in a will to truth, but which presupposes a completely different will. Come on. Knowledge as critique. The will to truth. Or truth must descend or ascend from morality and religion, which have been replaced by the ascetic, really, is better. That different one. Aesthetic. If we want to replace the ascetic ideal, that truth is another world, our will to truth, to knowledge, must come from a different will. I don't think it is. So that the ascetic, okay, ascetic ideal can't replace itself. Thought and life. I'll just try this. Ascetic. Whoops, used your ashtray. 13, thought and life. There you go. Nietzsche often takes knowledge to task for its claim to be opposed to life, to measure and judge life, for seeing itself as an end. The Socratic reversal already appeared in this form in The Birth of Tragedy. And Nietzsche never stops saying that, although it is a simple means subordinated to life, knowledge sets itself up as end, as judge, as supreme instance. But we must assess the importance of these texts. The opposition between knowledge and life and the operation by which knowledge makes itself judge of life are symptoms, only symptoms. Knowledge is opposed to life, but because it expresses a life which contradicts life, a reactive life which finds in knowledge a means of preserving and glorifying its type, Thus, knowledge gives life laws that separate it from what it can do, that keep it from acting, that forbid it to act, maintaining it in the narrow framework of scientifically observable reaction, almost like an animal in a zoo. But this knowledge that measures, limits, and molds life is itself entirely molded on reactive life within the limits of reactive life. It is not therefore surprising that other Nietzschean texts are more complex, not confining themselves to symptoms, but penetrating into interpretation. In these texts, Nietzsche takes knowledge to task, not for seeing itself as an end, but for making thought a simple means of serving life. Nietzsche no longer reproaches Socrates for having put life at the service of knowledge, but, on the contrary, for having put thought at the service of life. In Socrates, thought serves life, whereas in all previous philosophers, life served thought. PTG. There is no contradiction between these two kinds of texts. But, I mean, if we are first of all sensitive to the different nuances of the word life, when Socrates makes life the servant of knowledge, this must be understood as the whole of life, which, in this way, becomes reactive. But when he makes thought the servant of life, this life must be understood as a particular type of life, the reactive life, which then becomes the model for the whole of life and for thought itself. And the conflict between the two kinds of texts will be further reduced if we are sensitive to the difference between knowledge and thought. Here again, is this not here a Kantian theme profoundly transformed and turned back against Kant? When knowledge becomes a legislator, the most important thing to be subjected is thought. Knowledge is thought itself, but thought subject to reason and to all that is expressed in reason. The instinct for knowledge is therefore thought, but thought in its relation to the reactive forces which seize and conquer it. For rational knowledge sets the same limits to life as reasonable life sets to thought. Life is subject to knowledge, and at the same time, thought is subject to life. Reason sometimes dissuades and sometimes forbids us to cross certain limits. Because it is useless, knowledge is there to predict. Because it would be evil, life is there to be virtuous. Because it is impossible, there is nothing to see nor think behind the truth. 25. Apollo already appeared in this form in The Birth of Tragedy. He traces limits round individuals by again and again calling these to mind as the most sacred laws of the world, with his demands for self-knowledge and measure beyond Birth of Tragedy 9, page 72. Right, 25. But does not critique, understood as critique of knowledge itself, express new forces capable of giving thought another sense? A thought that would go to the limit of what life can do, a thought that would lead life to the limit of what it can do, a thought that would affirm life instead of a knowledge that is opposed to life. Life would be the active force of thought, but thought would be the affirmative power of life. Both would go in the same direction, carrying each other along, smashing restrictions, matching each other step for step in a burst of unparalleled creativity. Thinking would then mean discovering, inventing new possibilities of life. There are lives with prodigious difficulties. These are the lives of the thinkers, and we must lend an ear to what we are told about them, for here we discover possibilities of life, the mere story of which gives us joy and strength and sheds light on the lives of their successors. There is as much invention, reflection, boldness, despair, and hope here as in the voyages of the great navigators, and to tell the truth, these are also voyages of exploration in the most distant and perilous domains of life. What is surprising in these lives is that two opposed instincts, which pull in opposite directions, seem to be forced to walk under the same yoke. The instinct that leads to knowledge is constantly constrained to abandon the ground where man habitually lives and to throw itself into the uncertain, and the instinct that wills life is forced to grope ceaselessly in the dark for a new place to establish itself. PTG. In other words, life goes beyond the limits that knowledge fixes for itself, for it. But thought goes beyond the limits that life fixes for it. Thought ceases to be a ratio. 26, translators note, this translates the French word raison. See note 22, chapter 5. Thought ceases to be a ratio. Life ceases to be a reaction. The thinker thus expresses the noble affinity of thought and life making thought active, thought making life affirmative. In Nietzsche, this general affinity is not only the pre-Socratic secret par excellence, but also the essence of art. I'm going to continue on with this and then I might come back. I'm getting hungry. I might have to stop. Try this one. Art. Nietzsche has a tragic conception of art. It rests on two principles which must be understood as ancient ones, but also as principles on the future. Firstly, art is the opposite of a disinterested operation. It does not heal, calm, sublimate, or pay off. It does not suspend desire, instinct, or will. On the contrary, art is a stimulant of the will to power, something that excites willing. The critical sense of this principle is obvious. It exposes every reactive conception of art. When Aristotle understood tragedy as medical purging or moral sublimation, he gave it an interest, but an interest that was identical with that of reactive forces. When Kant distinguished beauty from all interests, even moral ones, he was still putting himself in the position of the spectator, but of a less and less gifted spectator who now has only a disinterested regard for beauty. When Schopenhauer elaborated his theory of disinterestedness, he was, on his own admission, generalizing a personal experience, the experience of the young man on whom art has the effect of a sexual sedative, like a sport has for others. Genealogy of Morals, III 6. Nietzsche's question is more insistent than ever. Who looks at beauty in a disinterested way? Art is always judged from the point of view of the spectator, and a less and less artistic spectator at that. Nietzsche demands an aesthetics of creation, the aesthetics of Pygmalion. I don't know who that is. King of Cyprus, who fashioned an ivory statue of a beautiful woman and loved it so deeply that in answer to his prayer, Aphrodite gave it life. The woman at some point named Galatea bore him a daughter, Phapos, or Phapos. Where is this? Pygmia, the aesthetics of Pygmia. Okay, Nietzsche demands an aesthetic of creation, the aesthetics of Pygmalion. But why? From this new standpoint, does art emerge as a stimulant on the will to power? Why does the will to power need something to excite it when it needs no motive, goal, or representation? This is because it can only be set up as affirmative in relation to active forces, to an active life. Affirmation is the product of a way of thinking which presupposes an active life as its condition and commitment, concomitant. Concomitant, naturally accompanying or associated. Affirmation is the product of a way of thinking which presupposes an active life as its condition and concomitant. According to Nietzsche, we have not yet understood what the life of an artist means. The activity of this life serves as a stimulant to the affirmation contained in the work of art itself, to the will to power of the artist as artist. The second principle of art is as follows. Art is the highest power of falsehood. It magnifies the world of error. It sanctifies the lie. The will to deception is turned into a superior ideal. 27. W.S. sketch for a preface 6. This is not the world as thing in itself. This is empty, empty of sense and worthy of a Homeric laugh. It is the world of error that is so rich in meaning, so profound, so marvellous. BPI 453. Art is given to us to prevent us dying of truth. Genealogy of Morals, III 25, pages 153 to 4. Art is in which precisely the lie is sanctified and the will to deception has a good conscience, is much more fundamentally opposed to the ascetic ideal than is science. This second principle is, in a way, the converse of the first. What is active in life can only be brought into effect in relation to a deeper affirmation. The activity of life is like a power of falsehood, a duping, dissimulating, dazzling, and seducing. But in order to be brought into effect, this power of falsehood must be selected, redoubled, and repeated, and thus elevated to a higher power. The power of falsehood must be taken as far as it will to deceive, an artistic will which alone is capable of competing with the ascetic ideal and successfully opposing it. GMIII 25. It is art which invents the lies that raise falsehood to its highest affirmative power, that turns the will to deceive into something that something which is affirmed in the power of falsehood. For the artist, appearance no longer means the negation of the real in this world, but this kind of selection, correction, redoubling, and affirmation. 28. T.I., Twilight of the Idols. Reason in philosophy. 6. Appearance here signifies reality once more, only selected, strengthened, corrected. The tragic artist is not a pessimist. It is precisely he who affirms all that is questionable and terrible in his existence. He is Dionysian, page 38. The truth perhaps takes on a new sense. Truth is appearance. Truth must begin, truth means bringing of power into effect, raising to the highest power. In Nietzsche, we the artists equals we the seekers after knowledge or truth equals we the inventors of new possibilities of life. Artists, because they select and transform and represent, they transform the negated life into a positive. Due to the selection and representing. All right, I'll see what I can do with this last one of chapter 3. Artists, because they select and transform, represent and represent. Because they select, transform, and represent, life, they transform the negated life into a positive due to that selection and representation. Representation as affirmation. Shall I go back up there? Let's have a look. Thought ceases to be a ratio. Life ceases to be a reaction. In other words, life goes beyond the limits that knowledge fixes for it, but thought goes beyond the limits that life fixes for it. Thought ceases to be a ratio. Life ceases to be a reaction. The thinker thus expresses the noble affinity of thought and life. Life makes thought active. Thought makes life affirmative. In Nietzsche, this general affinity is not only the pre-Socratic secret par excellence, but also the essence of art. I have to reread this section. Read this section. I just want to finish chapter 3 first. New image of thought. $15. No, I don't think I will because it's got points like that. And it's few pages. Few pages, isn't it? So that's coming next time. Sorry about that, YouTube. I know you were just hanging out for the end of the chapter then. So you just have to get over it. How? Create something. Piece of artwork. Stop recording. Thank you.